Okay, Chapter 23, this is how to create and use Windows Communication Foundation Services and Web API Services. So what does this chapter talk about? It talks about two different kinds of services. We're going to talk about how to develop and test a Windows Communication Foundation Services, the new kind of web services. There's an older kind too, the old .asmx file, and they're still out there, but this is the WCF is the newer kind of web service, and then there's an even newer kind, which we'll talk about, which is this whole web API service. So we're going to talk about both of these. We'll talk about how to develop an ASP.NET web page that consumes a WCF service and also a web API service. So we'll talk about the difference between the two. We'll talk about some of the things that make up these WCF services and these web API services. Talk about service contract, operation contract, data memory. These are all attributes that we use to decorate the classes to enable these services to be available over the web. We'll talk about how to test these services. We'll talk about how there's certain terminology we use when we talk about web services. So we talk about when we call a web service to say we consume a web service. So we'll talk about how we do that. And we can do it from multiple different clients. In this chapter, we talk about how to do it from an ASP.NET website. That's the client that consumes a web WCF service. We'll talk about how we we talk about both sides of the coin. We're going to talk about how to both create a WCF service and a web API service, and then we're also going to talk how to call or consume both a WCF and a web API service. And the web API services, we're going to talk about how what they are, but you'll notice or what you'll see in there is that it looks a little different. And what the difference is it uses Model View Controller, or MVC. So there's this whole routing framework. We introduced routing framework a little earlier in one of the other chapters, but there's more of this whole routing framework being used. There's a controller, there's an action method. So we'll get a sneak peek at MVC, which we're going to talk about next chapter. But since Web API Services uses it, we'll see a little bit of it, sort of a preview in this chapter. We'll talk about how we can call the GET methods of web API services. So what does that mean? We'll talk about what that is. And then finally, we'll talk about JavaScript and jQuery, which is a JavaScript library, and how we can use those to call or consume a web API service, not a WCF service. So one of the benefits that we'll talk about is how, why would we want to build a web API? Well, because we can do things like call it using JavaScript. All right. So, a Windows Communication Foundation service uses something called SOAP, Simple Object Access Protocol. And the way it works in this diagram is you have a client that will create a proxy class. So it's a class that runs on the client that stands in for the calls to the remote service. And then it makes these calls using this Simple Object Access Protocol over the internet, and then calls those remote methods through the service. And then these are called endpoints. The data comes back to the proxy, and that makes it available to the client. There's also some host that's running that's actually serving up all these methods in that service. So this could be IIS or some other application that's serving up the services. Now, a web API service is different in that it uses REST, or representational state transfer. And what this guy does is, instead of creating a proxy, the client code just calls. It uses web verbs like get and post and put, and so it'll just call the URL, and within the URL you'll have I'm using a REST API, so we have the API. Then what method or controller they call it. Am I calling this is the item controller, and then what value am I passing to it? And this is typically considered an ID, and then given this method and this ID, we can go say, go get item 01. And then the host, depending if you did a get, a put, or a post, would either go get it, or maybe a post is sort of an insert, or a put's sort of an insert, and then returns that data to the client directly. So there's no proxy required when you're using Web API and specifically REST. So what are some advantages of SOAP? It can be used over many different transport media, TCP, Microsoft message queuing, hypertext transfer protocol. It creates strict contracts between two parties, so I guess you can secure it because of that. So what are some advantages of using representational state transfer, or REST? It uses the existing HTTP standard. It's definitely faster, and it's also easier to configure. So it's smaller, leaner, meaner. It's the way to go. It's the way people. It's the current state of affairs. Most people are doing REST calls nowadays. SOAP is the older way of doing things. It returns REST also returns, why is it faster? It returns data in a format called JSON or JavaScript object notation, which is or alternatively you could use XML, but the SOAP always uses XML. And it's fatter, chattier, it's more data. So that's why one of the reasons why REST is much faster, because it uses this JSON by default. And we'll see examples of that in a bit. So the new project dialog box. This is the idea that when we go and create a new project, we want to do a WCF application. We want to write services, right? Maybe we're either providing weather services. Somebody's going to send us a zip code. We're going to return the weather for that zip code, or maybe they're going to send us an ISBN number, and we're going to return them the price that we're selling that book for. So there's various web services out there. Barnes & Noble has web services. Amazon has web services. Just tons of web services out there. If you want to create your own web service, to provide to either some of your other applications or to third-party applications, one of the ways to do it is by creating this WCF service application. So go into Visual Studio and say, hey, I'm going to create a new WCF service application. And in Chapter 23 in the book application, they create one for the shopping cart to return categories of the things that you can buy. So you literally would go in and start, create a new WCF service app, select the WCF template group, select the WCF service application template, give it a name, click OK. And then the book goes on to give you some hints, tips, and tricks, really, of renaming the existing code that Visual Studio generates for you. So one of the things they recommend is you can right-click and add a new WFC service and give it, because what happens is you're going to get the default is a service called Service 1. And if you want to rename that, you have to make sure you rename it everywhere. Not just the file name, but the class name inside of that, the interface name inside of that. So there's actually an interface. That's what the I is. And we didn't really talk a whole bunch about C# and interfaces. But the idea behind an interface is that it defines the operations that a class will then later implement. And it represents that contract to the outside world, so that if you later change something internally, your contract stays the same and you won't break people's, people who are using your services, that your code won't break because you're still keeping the contract the same. So the interface, when it first gets named, we might not like that. And there is a refactor command in Visual Studio you can use to rename that throughout, or you can just add your own. So that's what this guy talks about, ways of doing that. And specifically in their example, how after they do that, they add the app data folder and add the data access layer to that folder to configure the services. And this is the example they give you where they're actually creating a service. This is that interface I talked about. So what we're saying here is we've got a class that, we're defining the interface, excuse me. So we're saying this is the interface. We're going to have a method called getCategories. And what does it return? A list of categories, a collection of categories. We have a method called getCategoryById, string, that takes a string and it returns a category object. Notice these are all decorated. The different methods are decorated with the operation contract attribute. That makes them accessible over the internet as a web service. And then the interface itself is also decorated with this service contract. So these are almost like keywords, because these are specific attributes that are available in .NET Framework. So by decorating this with when I say decorate, I simply mean I put it over top. So the service contract is right on top of the iCategory service interface that's been decorated with that contract. That makes it a web service. The getCategories method, or operation, I should say. It's not a method because we haven't defined the method body here. It's just an operation. That's what a category contains, a list of operations. So the getCategories operation is decorated and people wouldn't be able to call it. And then there's some more down here. Similarly, whoops, where'd it go? Went ahead one too many. Similarly, down here we have attributes, the data contract and data members, and they function in the same way, where we're saying, hey, we've got this class called category, and it returns, this is our data contract. And down here we have category ID. Now this is a property, but if you remember, we mentioned a while ago, a property is just secretly it's a method. So again, these are all, even though they're properties, we're allowed to introduce them into an interface because they're really just methods, and we're defining that this category service interface will, any class that implements this interface, that's what they say, that a class would then later implement this interface, is going to support these methods and these properties. So finally, we actually get to where we say, all right, let's actually implement that interface. So that's what this colon, I think we mentioned earlier that we could inherit. If we had a form, we could inherit a new form from that form, and we would get all the methods and properties of that form. In the same way, we can implement a interface, and what that does is that says, okay, this class will then promise to implement every method and property that you defined in the interface. So now that we've done this little colon here, we're saying, okay, we're going to define a category service. So we're going to define a get categories, and it has to match the signature of the interface. So it has to have the same return value. It's going to return a list of categories. We're going to have a category by ID that takes a string and returns a category data type. So Visual Studio does make this a lot easier for you. Let me jump out to Visual Studio for a second. Let's so this is the book application from, actually this is the Web API one. Let me close this and open up the WCF one. So close the Web API, and we'll grab 23. And notice there's 4 for 23. There's a client and the actual service for WCF, and then there's a client and the actual API for WebAPI. So we'll start with the actual service for WCF. So I'll go open that guy up and open up the solution. And so this is the service. And what you'll notice in here, I was messing around earlier. I added my own interface called numbers, but the one they give you is called category. So this is that category service that was created by the author. And you can see he defines a interface and labels his methods as operations. Then later he defines a class in the .svc file, and that says, hey, I implement that. That's what this colon here is saying. I implement that service. So that interface. So when I do that, you can actually right click here and say implement the interface. And if I did that, it would actually generate all these methods for me. So let me do another one so you can see what I'm talking about. So how did I get here? In fact, I don't want to do one from scratch, but if I did one from scratch, I would say File, New Project. And I would do a web app. Looks like I am doing one from scratch. That's fine. We'll call this Demo WCF. And we're doing what? We're not doing Web API. Let me back up. See, I got into Web API mode. Hold on. Let me back up here. What do we want to do? We want to do a C# WCF service application. There we go. Not the web, not Web API. I'm jumping the gun. Let's do a WCF service app. So we'll call this WCF service demo 1. Say OK. So this is our WCF service app. Now here's that service1.svc file that it creates for us, and then that service1 interface it creates for us. So it gives us some example to get started. If I wanted to rename this, it's not good enough to just rename it. I have to. So maybe I'll do a math service, right? So we have actually, let me start with the class. So I'll come in here and I'll say rename this guy. We'll call this math. And if we go in there, we'll notice that the service didn't change. So I really need to come in here and refactor and say, hey, I want you to rename it everywhere you find it. It gives me a little preview. I'll say, yeah, it looks good. That's the proper way to rename something. And then if I do the same thing here, let's do it here, refactor that. Call that iMath, so interface math. Yeah, do it everywhere. So now I've gotten, let's rename the file too. iMath. So there's my interface, there's my class. And if I didn't want to do the renaming, I could have came in here and said, hey, the other way to do it is just add a new one, right? I could have came in here and said add a service, WCF service, and we'll call this, what else? Besides math, maybe I've got a reading service that does, I don't know, return some sort of reading. information. And you'll see it gives me an interface for my reading and a service for my reading. And then the class is already named. So it is kind of easier just to add a fresh one. So in my math service, what kind of services might I want to provide? I might want to provide, there's already one called get data and just returns, a value. But what I might want to provide is an add function. So I'll say add. What's it return? It returns an integer. Keep it simple. And what's it take? 2 parameters, maybe an x, 2 integers, an x and a y. And then it's going to return x plus y. So real simple there, right? Now I'm doing this a little backwards. I just added the class, I added this function to the class. But if I run this, you won't see this method available as a web service yet. And I'll show you why. Let me actually run it. So when you run a web service, it comes up with a test harness, a test client, if you will, that will allow you to test your web services. So that's what's popping up here. And so you can see I've got the get data and the get data using data contract. So I can execute that and come over here and say invoke, and it will give me a little warning that I'm insecure, but whatever. And there's that value coming back. So I can even put a breakpoint here on this get data so I can debug it and try that again. Get data, invoke. And so there I am, and I'm stepping through my code, my web service that I created, and it runs that. But where's my ad? Well, the ad's not there because I didn't decorate it as a web service. And the reason I didn't decorate it is because I forgot to put it in the interface. So let me go to my interface, and notice, see, I've got all these contracts. There's the get data. There's that operation contract. So let me go in here and add one for my add operation. And this will be, it's an integer, it does an add, and it takes one integer plus another integer. And I'm intentionally giving them different parameter names to demonstrate that the parameter names don't matter. It's the parameter signature, in other words, the number of parameters and the data type of the parameters. So the fact that this is a two integer parameter signature, it means it's going to match, and I'm going to be okay. So if I do a build, we'll be all right. It's going to say okay. If I had added a third parameter, now all of a sudden it's going to build, but that's not going to match the one that I defined. And actually, it's not going to build, right? Because it's saying, so here's a good point. My interface is saying, hey, you're looking for an add that takes 3 parameters, and you've got a class that doesn't fully implement that. So what would I do? And what if I did want to have one? What if I want to have both of them? Let me add another one. Say I have 2 adds. I'm going to overload my add method. Right? When you have the same method with 2 different parameter signatures, that's called overloading your method. So now I'm saying my interface, I support 3 integers and 2 integers. So when I do this, now I'll be able to build okay because I've got the 2 integers. Oh, but I haven't implemented the 3 integer part of the contract. So I go back to my math that implements that and say, hey, let's implement the rest of that operation. So go to my interface and say implement the interface. I'm going to go implement it because it knows this didn't pop up earlier, but it's showing up now because it knows I haven't fully implemented the interface. When I do that, look, it's going to go add that other method that I defined in my interface. If I scroll down here, there's the last method I need to add. So now I can do a build, but let me actually really implement it, not just throw a new exception. That's not good. So what will we do here? Well, we simply return A plus B plus X. All right, so now I've got an add that takes 3 integers, and my original one up here that takes 2 integers. And now, because they both are included in the interface, and the interface is decorated, the methods are decorated properly, when I run my test harness, they will show up as callable web services. So running this test harness, we'll see we've got my add, and this is my other add. I actually added a parameter so that I could see so that they would differentiate it. So there's the 3-way add with the A, B, and the X, and there's the 2-way add with the A, B. And I can give it some parameters and invoke it. There's the return value, or I can do the 3-way and give it parameters and invoke it. Tired of looking at that. And there's its return value. So what we saw there is I added a new service, this math service. I added a couple of different methods to the contract, and this is where I added a name three-way so I could differentiate this add method versus that add method. I needed this name to, otherwise it threw an error. What else? And then in the math service, I actually implemented both the 2 integer add method and down here the 3 integer add method. Okay. What else? So in the books example, they've got a bit more beefy examples where they're actually they've got a data access layer and they're actually calling insert category and delete category and update category and get category. So take a look at that for a more real world example. And we've seen the test client already. They mentioned, not only can you use the test client window, but you can also, a couple requirements. So the SV file has to be set as the starting page. So one thing I ran into earlier, when I renamed that file, if I don't right click this and make sure this is the starting page, I could get into an issue where the test client won't pop up. So make sure you've got one of your services. Where's my other service? My reading service. I could set that as the start page 2, and then that would still bring up the client, the test client. But it would, it just brings it up with whatever service, so that service doesn't have any operations. Now, this test client will allow you to add additional services, so it doesn't matter which one you start with. You can actually add the other one. So this is my math one. So now I can look at both of them. There's just the reading, which I haven't really added any methods to, and then there's the math one. However, if you're not careful, here's what can go wrong. Let me close this out for a second. So let me say, you know what? I decided I'm not doing reading. Let's delete that. So go ahead and get rid of you. And we don't need the contract either since we got rid of the service. Make sure everything still compiles okay. So now let's run this thing. And what I'm trying to, it was smart enough to set my math as my default. I was trying to, let's see if I rename this. I'm trying to make it so that my default, my start page is not my service anymore. So if I were to somehow rename this, maybe, call this my math, and now run this guy. No, I still get the client. It's still smart. But you can, trust me, you can sometimes lose your start page, and then it will just come up as a regular website. And you'll say, hey, what's going on? Why isn't the client running? Just make sure you right-click whichever service you want to start with and make that your start page, and that way you'll always have the client come up as expected. All right. The other thing you can do, so when you're running, you can go to a web browser and bring up, if I knew the port, I think I know the port, let's see. It's my port, let's find out. Go to my, so I'm running on 25.290. Can we browse it? Perfect. So here's what happens if you forget to set your start page. And you can click on any of these these service files, SVC files. And this is what you would get if you didn't have the test client, where you can still see information about how to call the service. So you can see there's a command line utility, a service utility you could run to get the WSDL or WSDL. That stands for Web Service Description Language. So when you click on that, it actually gives you, this is what .NET uses to determine how, what parameters it needs to be called, what methods are available. We don't typically, as an end user, don't really look at this. It's just some XML file that describes the operations available. Another way to call it, the same kind of thing there. But so when clicking on the SVV file, it does give you some information about possible ways to implement the services. And in fact, we're going to use this next one next, where we're going to actually use a client to instantiate a proxy to call the service, and then close it when we're done. So let's see, is that next on our agenda? I think it is. So we talked about clicking on the SVC file. And then in the book, they give you an example where they're calling the services in the book to get all the costumes and using insert mode. And then this is where they say, okay, now let's use another application to call the services that we just made available. So in this example, they're adding a service reference to some application. So let's do that. Let's go back to our Visual Studio and stop debugging. Let's add, and there's a couple different ways to do that. I can go to my solution and add a new project. So let's go and say let's add a new project. And this doesn't have to be a web app. It could be a Windows app. It could be some other kind of app. But I'll do a web app since we've been doing web apps. So we'll go in here and we'll say let's do a web app. And we'll call this the Math Client because it's going to call our client web service that I just did. So what is this going to be? This is a, actually I don't want any of these. I just want the, let me go back. A simple one, right? I just want a simple, empty Math Client. That looks good. So here's my Math Client. Let's go ahead and add a default page to this. Web forms, where's my, where it is, hiding from me. Let's try to keep it simple. Call this default.aspx. And we're just going to go in and add, you know, something to call the add method. So we'll add a couple of text boxes. 1, 2, 3. We'll add a button to actually go and call the method. So where's my button? And then we'll have something to, whoops, go back to default, something to show the results. So one more text box to show the results. Alright, and that'll be result. And then this is, you know, well, we don't need to label them, but we could if we wanted to. Alright, so let's make this our startup project. So this is the 2-project solution, but now we want this one to be the startup, and we'll make that our start page. And when we run this, it just doesn't do anything yet. It just brings up our default.aspx page. Alrighty, we're excited about that. Let's actually do something when we click the button. So when we click the button, what we're going to do is we're going to instantiate a proxy class that will then call the remote web services for us. So before I can do that, I actually have to add a reference to the client that I'm running to this remote web service. So I'll come in here and say add service reference. And it needs the URI, Universal Resource Indicator, of that web service. So what was it? I just had it, right? It was, is that the right port? Go back to my IS Express. No, it's not the right one. We need 25290. But if I got it wrong, no big deal. It would go there and it would come back and say, no, that's not the right one. So okay, let's go find it. And actually, when you're developing, there's a neat little discover one, so it can actually go find it. There's that 25290. So if I didn't know it, I could just click discover. All right. So yeah, this is the service I want to call. What do I want to call it in my client code? We'll call this math service. I'll call it my math service just to be different. Say OK to that. So now I've added a service reference to it in my math client website. I can come into it when the button click and I can say, hey, my math service, and then I can call the math proxy, which is a math client. We'll call it we'll just call this proxy, I guess, is equal to new. I'm going to instantiate that proxy using the web service, the remote class. And now I can use that proxy to call the methods that are available. So there's that add method, and did I have three-way in here somewhere? There's the three-way method. So what we can do is we can say something, let's get fancy. We'll say that if this third text box is empty, so if text box 3.text is nothing, then we'll call the regular add. Otherwise, we'll call the three-way add. All right. So let's put in the parameters and fix our indentation here a little bit. I lost my, it would normally fix it for me, but I lost my bracket. There we go. All right. Heaven help us, we forget a bracket, and then all of a sudden things don't indent properly. So this one wants what? 2 parameters. So text box 1 and text box 2. So I use the this keyword to help me do some typing. And the other one is text box 2. And I can't, those are strings, right? You see a little pop-up that says string text box, so I need to convert those guys. I'll use the int data type and tell it to parse that string. So that'll convert those to integers, since my web service is expecting an integer. How do I know that? If I hover over my ad, you'll see it says, oh, I expect an int and another int. So, okay, we will do that for you, sir. Parse that guy. So now we've parsed text box 1, parsed text box 2, passed those two to the proxy, and we'll do something similar down here. In fact, I'll just copy those parameters because I'm going to need them. But we need one more. One final int dot parse text box 3. And where are we going to take the return value? We could create a int return value, I guess. We'll initialize it to 0. Don't have to, but we will. I like to initialize my variables. Down here we'll say return value is that. Return value is that. So no matter what, we'll then take the results, which we said we're going to show in text box 4, and set that equal to the return value. But we don't want to do an integer. We want that to be a string. So we'll call toString to convert it to a string. How's that look? Looks like it might work. Put a breakpoint on here and we'll step through it. Okay, so while this fires up. Oh, I forgot to set my startup project. So we're still looking at the test client. Let me go back and make my startup project. Start page. Run it again. Got my breakpoint. So our really simple website, web client, web math, if we try to put 2 numbers in here and we tell it to add them together, it'll go to our client code, which will instantiate the proxy to the web service and then call whichever one, in this case the 2, so it's actually calling the web service. Now if I wanted to, I could even put a breakpoint on the web service, right? If I go to my Solution Explorer, because I've got them both in as part of my solution, I could go to the web service and actually step into that as well. So let me go and finish running that, get the value back. But let's go back to my Solution Explorer, go to the web service, the math service, and I can say, hey, you know, when we get in here, let's put a breakpoint on the 3-way. Call that next. Put a breakpoint on that. So now when we go and we do 3 numbers, and we step into, this is the client, stepping in, stepping in, stepping in. I stepped over, hit the wrong button, but let me go back. Let's step into, hit the F11 key. It's saying yes, I want to step into. Oh, and I can't step into it. Probably because I backed it up. Let me try it one more time. I'll let that finish. Well, that's a bug, right? Well, that should have been 7. Try that again. I don't think it didn't actually, because of my moving around there, I didn't actually call the web service. So let's step into it. This time I'll try to hit the right key. Oh, well, let me step into my web service. That's normally, oh, and the other thing I'm doing wrong, notice I didn't, where'd my 3rd parameter go? So let's finish that. Let's stop debugging and fix that. There's my third parameter. All right. Oh, it would help if I call the right method too, right? So this is not add, but three-way. There we go. Now it would look better. Let's run that. Try 3 values. Get it in my client. Step into. And now I'm stepping into my web service, verifying. Now, even though I called the three-way method, I'm calling the three-way add because I actually decorated it with the three-way keyword up in the interface. That's why it's being called three-way, but it's really add with 3 parameters. And finish running it. And there's the proper execution of the web service via my web client. All right, so let's wrap this section up. So we created a client, we added a reference to a web service from the client. You can actually run 2 different versions of Visual Studio. That would be the other way of having one Visual Studio run the client and one run the web service. The way I did it, I had both projects in one solution, either or. And then the book talks about how to add, which we just did, adding the web service as a reference to a website. And then they actually go in to show you the C. This is what we did, very much simpler. But in their example, they're instantiating a proxy to their category service client and then calling it, passing it the FX category. Oh, they properly closed their service. I forgot to do that. It's best practice is to do that. Otherwise, you might have a memory leak. So make sure you call close on your service when you're done. The last thing the book mentions on this topic is that once you do, you set up these web services, then you can then actually bind to them using that object data source we talked about not too long ago. So you can actually say, hey, I've got this web service that I want to call, and it's an object, so I'm going to use an object data source to tie to it and bind to it, and you can specify, the different properties of the details view to bind to that data source. All right, the next section is how to start a new web API service. Okay, so the next section of the book, chapter 23, talks about how to start a new API, a web API service. So this is the newer version of web services. This is the one that uses the REST, or representational state transfer. So how do we start it? Obviously, you can go into Visual Studio and do File New Project, and then what you do is you would select under the Web Template group an ASP.NET MVC4 web application template. And from there, then you can say this is going to be a web API template. So let me show you that. Jump out to Visual Studio. Let's close our old style web WCF web service. So let's stop this guy. And now let's do a new one. So we'll come in here and say we want to do a new project. And we want web, ASP.NET web application. We'll call this our web API demo, and say OK. Oh, and it looks like I used that name already, so this is web demo 2. And from here we'll say, what kind of web do we want? Well, we want one that's going to host web APIs. So we'll go ahead and select that. There's some other choices here. This is Visual Studio 2013, so it actually, hey, do you want to set up all the classes and objects you need for authentication? Do you want to host it in the cloud? If you have 2012, you won't have this, but 2013, that's a new, even more help to set me up so I get people to log in to call my web API. So just, in production is probably a good thing. For my demo purposes, I'm going to keep it more simpler, so I'm not going to do, we're going to say no authentication, just to simplify things a little bit, and we're not going to host in the cloud. All right, so I got my web API. I'm going to say OK. So go out there and create my web API project. And it gives me that little sort of a little bit of a test harness, and my Solution Explorer, you can see all the framework that it created for me. So there's this thing called controllers that it creates for me. We'll talk more about this in the next chapter when we talk about MVC, but that's what this is. There's models, there's views. So there's, home view and a start view and all that. What the book talks about here, so we won't get into the MVC part of it too much just yet, is adding a new service, right? So if I flip back to the slides for a second, how do we add initial services? So, and again, just like with WCF, I can either rename the existing one or I can add a new controller to create a brand new one. So let's do that. Let's jump back out to Visual Studio. And let's say, hey, we're going to add, they actually give us one to start with. This is that values controller. This is their sample API that I could go rename and reuse if I wanted to. So if I run this right now without actually adding anything else, I'll get the value. Let's actually see that. So let's run that. And this is the test harness that it creates for me. Kind of like the WCF client test, but this one is actually web-based. And I'll click on this link for API. That'll show me the existing web services that are available. And right now I've only got the ones that were default generated for me. So I've got get API values, values by ID, and then there's the put, post, and delete. So if we say, and the way to call these, so if I click on this, it'll show me some more information about it. But the return value and the different formats available. But if I actually want to call it, what I do, I don't have to go instantiate a proxy like I did with WCF. I can just come up to my URL, and I'll actually create another window here, another tab. But I simply give it the URL API, and then the controller that I want to call, or the API I want to call. So I'll say values, and because it's returning JSON, it's not actually going to bring it up in my browser. It's going to download it as a file. So there you can see my values JSON file is available. So I'll say go ahead and open that up. And by default, it's going to open up in Visual Studio. So there's the return values, value 1, value 2. So if I wanted to change those values and say, that's not really, very helpful, let me stop this for a second. I would go to the method, the get method, and change the implementation. So right now here it's just returning an array of strings. It's an enumerable of strings. That's what the return type is. So we use this array notation. This is array notation in C#, and we're specifying just a bunch of values. So if this was actually, maybe instead of values, if this was like months of the year, this might be January, February, and probably I'd be looking this up from a database or something like that. But that's one way to I'm just modifying the existing code, so now it's a little more meaningful. Now when I make that call, where's my API? I don't have to click the API again. I'm just clicking it, so okay. See what I'm doing. API/values, and we should get all three of them. There they are. And then if I wanted to get a specific value, I could say, hey, let me see API values. Let's see the second one, which would be 1, right? 0 based. Let's see which one that returns. Just comes back as, because I didn't so what, where'd that come from? Let's go and look at the code. This right here, right? So I didn't change this implementation. So no matter what ID I pass it's going to return the same thing. It probably it'd be more meaningful if I also updated that code. It did something down here like, a case statement. So if it's 1, we'll return January. If it's 2, we'll return February. And If it's 3, return March. And if they put any other number, I don't think we've mentioned case statements. We didn't do a whole dig into it too much. But if you're not familiar with that, this is the switch and case statement that's available to you in C#. Finally, no matter if they do some other value, then we'll return December. That'll be our default. And then let's close this whole thing in brackets. Get my syntax right. That looks better. So no matter what ID they send, see that builds. We don't need this anymore. It's crying that I'm unreachable code, but I don't think that's unreachable. Let's run it and see what happens. All right. So now, what APIs do we have? Let's call that other API where we pass an ID, which is, oops, we'll say 3. And I'll come down in here, hit 3, return March. When I open this, out comes March. And if I do it again and do something like, oops, 7, it'll hit that default and throw that back. So there's a little modifying the existing code. Now what do we want to add our own? So let's do that. Let's add our own service. So the way we do it, it's a bit different. It's a bit, I think, easier than we did with WCF in that when we add our own code here, we don't need to mess around with the whole interface. It's a simplified process here. We're going to go in here, we're going to add a controller. So this Web API controller class. And we'll call this, and the name is important. The name is actually, there's this idea in MVC, and again, I know we'll talk about it more later, but it's called code by convention, so that the names actually will be used later, to call the methods in the controller. So we'll call this one months. If I'm going to, do this, or what we did, well, that's fine. We'll do months. We'll return, or yeah, months is fine. So we'll say this is our months controller. And now, what we would do is we would say, you can see we've got a class called months. It gives me that, the get whatever. And basically, I put the same code here, or whatever code I want to implement that logic. But look how easy that was to, I generate, there's no interface to have to worry about now if I run this guy. Watch the API. Just that quickly, I've got a whole new set of APIs that I can call. I'll go to my API, and now I've got a month by ID, blah blah blah. All those verbs are there's a template code that I can then modify. So if I want to go call the months one, I can go put it in the URL, and testing it. Don't have to do a proxy. None of that stuff we did with WCF. You may be starting to get realize, hey, this is actually, it's a lot cleaner, it's less chatty, it performs better. It's the future. So here we called months, and that's where that controller name came into. Why I mentioned it was important, because I'm actually using it in the URL, and that ties it to that control. Which controller to respond. So it was just that easy. I added a controller. And now if I go to my controllers, actually, where does it put that controller? It put it up here, which is okay, I guess. Again, but the name is important. So the fact that I called it months controller, it used that months word in the API, and that's what ties the two together. All right. The next few slides just kind of hammer that point home even further. the get methods, they all in their example in the book, they create a categories controller. So you still have a get method, but it's the categories that the name of the categories that ties the controller to the methods. They mentioned in the book there's an attribute here from body, and that's useful for the post verb, because that's basically saying down here, if we don't have the from body, the string ID, we're getting that from the API categories, and then the third item there is considered the ID. But if I want additional parameters, I can say, hey, go look at from what's posted out there from the body, and then get that value. So what does that look like? Let me go to our C# code, and I'll show you that in just a second. These are some of the other examples of calling. So there are other ways you can call these URLs. You can do it, sort of by convention, API, then the name of your controller, and then an ID. You can specify additional. So this one specifies a name instead of an ID. So that's another way to do that. And then this name has to match the parameter name that you define in your code. This is testing it, where just what I was doing, where I'm just putting it in the browser and then opening up the JSON to look at the return values. Okay, we've looked at all that. There's the example from the book. Now, the example from the book is what I want to get at. Actually uses a post to do an insert. And so what they do in their code here, this is just setting up the, and they use this WebAPI JavaScript and also jQuery. So if you're not familiar with those two, there's actually a whole other book on it. You don't have to learn, you don't have to know it, you don't have to be an expert at it to start dabbling in it and getting used to it. That's another thing that's sort of the wave of the future now, though. Everyone's using jQuery and JavaScript to make these client-side calls, and that's exactly what's going on here. So what they do here is these are all calls from that from the JavaScript library, and then this will do the insert. So if I go and we dig into that actual JavaScript, you'll see we set up the API. This is the URL it's going to call, and then down here, the ready function in jQuery says run this when the document's ready. So this is sort of like the auto start. So as soon as the document, or after the document's loaded, it's going to go and run this function. This is go display categories, and then this. If you're not familiar with jQuery, these are selectors. So we're saying, hey, go select the document, and then when it's ready, run this function. Down here, we're saying go select the document body and add a click event that's going to go find the category. Down here, this is that display categories function, and it's going to go call that API that we specified, and then for each row that comes back, it's going to build the result set. Find category is another one that's going out there and looking at the message tag and replacing it with this URL, this HTML that it's getting from a JSON call. Down here, what are we doing? This is the post, and down here you can see where it's saying, hey, go post the data. Where's the category data coming from? It's coming from the form, the HTML form. That's this. This pound, by the way, is the ID of an HTML element. So it's saying go find the HTML element that has ID equal form 1. So that's going to be the form that's going to have our category ID, our short name, our long name. So up here, in this case, it's go select the element where the ID is equal to ID. Go select the element where the ID is short. Go select the element where the ID is long. Go select the element where the ID is message. Get the value of those guys and then stick them in these variables, or actually grab these variables, and replace those the value of those HTML elements. So this is finding the category and displaying it. Down here, we're grabbing all the data from the form and posting it to that API that we defined earlier. And so the from body that we saw earlier is going to grab it from the form and use that data. So what is that? Let me show you that. It might make more sense if you actually see it. Let's open that website up. And this is the WebAPI client. So, well, actually, let me show you both of them. So let's open up the Web API first. This is what's serving up the categories, and it's just like what we were seeing when I just did the demo one. I didn't set a start page, but that's okay. Let's go back and I opened it up as a web. I should have opened up the project. Let me close that and redo that. Close that. Nah, don't save it. File, open, project solution. Go to the Murachs directory. Book exercises. And this was what? Chapter 23. And let me open up the Web API first. There we go. That looks better. And then when we run this guy, we should see the APIs that are being provided. So I click on the API link. Looks a little different. This was built with Visual Studio 2012. The one I did earlier was a 2013 one, but it's basically the same principle. And then there's the APIs that are provided. So if we look at, say, categories, and we actually go call that guy, I actually had some breakpoints. I was playing with this earlier, so you step in, you can see we're actually getting categories, and then we're going actually running, we're creating a list of categories, run some SQL statement to go out to SQL and get those categories, open the connection, go out and get the data. It's hitting my SQL server, it's coming back, it's doing the SQL reader, and now it's stepping through and grabbing each one. There shouldn't be that many of them. Put a breakpoint down here and run to that. Finally close our data reader. Return that back to the API, and then that's going to return it back as JSON to us. So we'll open that up and take a look at it. And there it is. All the categories. Looks like I threw one in there called DEP. So that's the client that's serving, that's the API service that serves up categories. Now let's go look at the client that makes use of that service. So we'll go open up website, client, and run this guy. So there's no reference like we did with WCF. It just uses the URLs to reference the client. So now you can see it's loading. Oh, it had an error. It had an error because I'm not running the API service. So let me do that. Let me go open up another Visual Studio. And I've got to serve up the API in order to use it. Last time I did them both with WCF, I did them both in the same project. Now I'll just use a separate Visual Studio. So let's go open up. Should be in my recent list. Yep, that looks right. The Web API project. And let's run that guy. So I'm serving up, eventually I'm serving up, there we go. I'm serving up category APIs now. Category APIs for sale. So while that runs, I'll leave that do its thing. Go switch over to my other Visual Studio and check out it. So it had an error, but now that I'm serving up services, I'm running, and look, now it's going and getting the data. I'm hitting my breakpoint, my client breakpoint, and it loads the data, and I can do things like, new category, some new category, real long name there, and when I do the insert, you'll see it comes in here, it hits the insert, it's going to do the actual SQL insert, and I skipped over the part where it actually grabbed the name from the form and then injected it into this method, but let's see if I can get back to that. Actually, this is what calls the insert, but this is the from body parameter, and this is where it actually got it from the form. So you can see that if I look over that category, these are the three fields that it got from the HTML form. All right, okay. And then the book goes into more detail about what's going on in the code behind, which we kind of just stepped through. So that's it really for the Web API and the WCF service. There's no exercises, but at the end of 23, they give you some ideas. Maybe you can consume the category, write an app to consume the category WCF service to get practice setting references to that and creating a proxy like we did earlier. You could also then try another app to consume the web API service for, just to see the difference, see how much easier it is. If you have any questions, shoot me an email or try me in the Q&A panel in the live meeting. Thanks.